Sykes-Picot, the Anglo-French agreement on divisions in the Arab world, is 100 years old today, this day. And I promise you, if either of them had been told that the paper they were writing on with their thick pencils in a committee room in the House of Commons that I walked past almost every day for almost 30 years, if you had told them then that 100 years on it would still be in existence and the Arabs would be willing to kill each other for those lines drawn on the map by two foreigners, they would have laughed. But that is exactly the case. Of course, Sykes-Picot has become a kind of shorthand for imperialist, Western imperialist intervention in the Arab Middle East. And that's correct that it should be so. It doesn't mean that every line on every piece of paper was drawn by Sykes and Picot. There were many Sykes-Picots. 1915, 1916, 1917, 1920, 1921, 24, 32 when so-called Saudi Arabia was formed. And as late as 1971, the British were inventing countries in the Arab Middle East, in the case of the United Arab Emirates in the Persian Gulf. So, of course, Sykes-Picot is like a kind of cipher for all of the Western imperial interventions in the area. And the perfidy, the lying, the double dealing. For example, at one and the same time as Mr. Sykes and Picot were drawing their particular piece of this map, the very same British government was secretly dealing with Sharif Hussein and making promises to him through T.E. Lawrence, so-called Lawrence of Arabia, that were utterly and absolutely contradictory to the decisions that Sykes and Picot were making at exactly the same time. Ditto the 1917, 99 years ago, 1917 Balfour Declaration, which was at the same time as they were promising Sharif Hussein that there would be an independent Arab state from the Mediterranean onwards and outwards, including Palestine. They were promising the very same land to a very small group then of Zionist settlers, European colonizers who wanted a piece of the colonial action. And so, if Britain and France, for that matter, speak with forked tongue, then Sykes-Picot and all the treaties and agreements around it are a pretty good example of that. So, our program tonight is marking the exact, this day, centenary of the Sykes-Picot agreement, but we're asking a second part of that question. How will the US change the Middle East under present circumstances? What are those circumstances? They are no less than the collapse of the Sykes-Picot and other imperial agreements on borders. We take the Iraq-Syria border, for example. That's under a grave threat because at least 30% of Iraq is controlled by ISIS, an Al-Qaeda mutation, and at least 35% of Syria is controlled by the same outfit. And between them, there are no borders between Iraq and Syria. Turkey is behaving as if there were no borders between it and Iraq. The Kurdistan administration in the north of Iraq is acting as if there is no Iraq, at least not one in which they are apart. In Saudi Arabia, the by sword, merger of Najd and Hijaz is of course now under threat itself on a variety of levels, not least that a very substantial religious minority within Saudi Arabia is effectively now living in an apartheid state. Libya was once one country and is now at least 3, maybe 5, maybe 55 emirates by the time all these conflicts come to an end, if they ever do. I could go on, but then there would be no room for you. And we've got celebrated Middle East analyst and top journalist Hafsa Kara Mustafa in London on the line. Hafsa, go ahead.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. George, there's one thing that I recently discovered, which was that in Iraq in the 20s, in reaction to the actual Sykes-Picot agreement, there were obviously national revolts. And what happened was that Shia imams would go into Sunni mosques to preach national unity, and Sunni imams would go into Shia mosques to preach national unity.
My goodness, I wish we could have some of that now.
Exactly. Well, that's my point, really, because obviously even though the national movements were eventually crushed by the British, what it meant was that Iraqis continuously resisted foreign occupation until, of course, independence in 1958. And my point now is, in light of the US-led invasion of 2003, which you obviously resisted, and the sectarianism that is crushing and destroying Iraq from within, do you believe that actually this sectarianism is actually fueled and encouraged by the Americans? Because, of course, the more Shias hate Sunnis and the more Sunnis hate Shias, there really is no future for a stable, unified Iraq.
Well, I do and I don't. Of course, there is a pre-existing tendency to schism, fitna, sectarian difference, and so on within the Muslim Ummah. And there has been for a very, very long time, arguably from the beginning, from the revelation. But there's equally no doubt that the British and American invaders of Iraq deliberately incubated this sectarian hatred in order to divide and rule, in order to avoid having to face a unified national resistance to their invasion and occupation. And they played this off against that and him off against him, not just between sects, but inside sects. So inside one sect, you could have 2 or 3 leaders and forces identified, and you could play them off against each other also. Frankly, I'm uncomfortable with this subject in this sense, Hafsa. It's my point that as long as the Arabs and the Muslims can sit around in coffee shops blaming history and blaming others, they will never attend to their own affairs. The truth is this: Arabs are divided because they want to be divided, even though they know that that division makes them weak and that weakness makes them mugs. It means that foreigners can steal from them anything that they choose. The Arabs are conquered because they have been eminently conquerable. They are divided because they are easily divided. And of course that's true of the wider Muslim world as it is true of the Arab world. The truth is, the Arabs could unite tomorrow, but they don't want to. At least they don't want to enough to put aside their own petty interests and their own petty divisions. I was once party to a conversation between the then Chinese leadership and the then President Yasser Arafat. And the Chinese said to Arafat, the Arabs are not serious about recovering Palestine. If they were, they could all walk into Palestine and take it back. What could its occupiers do about it? They are, they said, as they were at that time, 3 millions, and you are, as they were at that time, 250 millions. There are not enough bullets to stop the Arabs doing so if they wanted. Hafsa, last word to you.
I would agree. I mean, I can't disagree with you. I think this division and this disunity is really what favored imperialism. I don't think I could exonerate the role of the British and the French and the Americans in the catastrophe that has befallen the Arab world today. But of course, the Arab division and the bitter sectarianism that is dividing the entire place really is favoring and making it so much easier for imperialists to divide, to destroy, and then to loot all our wealth. So yes,
well, let me give you just 2 quick points, and then I'll take your response to them. There are people alive today who were alive when Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan were one country, were known by those who lived there then as Bilad al-Sham. I once asked a very old man in Jordan, what did you call yourself before there was anything called Jordan? He said, we were Arabs from Bilad al-Sham, the land of Sham, greater Syria. And yet today there are people, many of them, many people, who would die, who would kill to protect the borders that were drawn by foreigners in the lifetime of some people alive today. My second point, Hafsa, the Arab Ba'ath Party, which stood for the unity of the Arabs, couldn't even unify itself. They ruled in Syria and they ruled in Iraq. If they had just joined only their 2 countries, there would have been an Arab state from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. How about that?
It's indeed a tragedy, George. I can't disagree with you on that point, absolutely. But I also think that the history, colonialism and everything has managed to create divisions that simply did not exist. The idea, it entrenched tribalism, it entrenched sectarianism, and from then on, you know, those little things that could have been overcome in the process of nation building were actually exacerbated when crises emerged, such as, for instance, the crumbling of oil prices that led to pauperization of the people and everything. So all these old bad tribal habits sort of resurfaced and made all this situation that we're seeing today possible. I totally agree. I think the division is very much our fault. I think we can overcome it if we actually worked hard towards it. But I also think that there are too many external factors that are actually forcing us to remain divided.
Okay,
so really
Hafsa, Kara Mustafa, a pleasure to disagree with you, even if we only disagreed in nuance. A wonderful contribution. Thanks.